Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the IVAC ISBEO SafetyNet webinar series presented today with Kevin Honan and Gary Webb of Aviation Manuals talking about mastering MELs, the essential insights. I'm Catherine Hilst, and I am the ISBEO Operations Manager. And I just want to run through a few housekeeping items before we get started. Due to the number of the attendees, the audience members are on mute. And you'll stay on mute during the presentation, but there is a questions box where you can submit your questions or comments, and we welcome those at any time during the session. It's basically in the control panel for GoToWebinar, and there will be a place to type the questions. We'll see them on our side, and we'll address them after the presentation. So we're very excited to host this session covering essential insights on MELs. The MEL is a critical component for safety and compliance as an operator. In this webinar, the team of experts will uncover the layers of the MEL using the ICAO international and local standards to understand the document and what compliance looks like across a span of registries. You'll be equipped with insights on how to maintain compliance with operational procedures and safely navigate operating the aircraft without inoperative equipment. Kevin Honan, Senior Advisor, has been with Aviation Manuals as an aviation specialist for over 10 years. He's responsible for overseeing operational, safety management system, and emergency procedures content for fixed and rotary wing operators, drone operators, technicians, and FBOs. He's passionate about education and brings SMS and safety knowledge to the industry. He served on numerous panels on web and in-person events alongside the FAA, NBA, and industry operators and partners. Gary Webb, Operations Advisor, has been with Aviation Manuals for over 3 years. He specializes in MELs and is very active in the business aviation community through YoPro and other industry committees. A passion for the coalescence of business and aeronautics is what continuously drives him to be an advocate for aviation safety management throughout the community. Gary and Kevin, welcome. I'm looking forward to this, and I will turn this over to you.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful intro. Just to clear up, since we're both on the same screen, you can't see the little name below. I'm Gary, and this is Kevin here.
Good day, everybody.
So thanks so much for having us, and everyone, welcome to Mastering MELs, the Essential Insights. So today, you can go ahead. Today we're going to start discussing all things MEL, obviously. We're going to begin with kind of the basics and then jump into why it's required, then to what all the concepts and what different items we need to put in to build an MEL. Then we're going to discuss how to use it, and lastly we're going to end with how to keep it current and what you need to do to update it.
And we'll also talk about some gotchas we've seen through our experience working with operators on MELs, some kind of tricky areas that some operators tend to need help with.
A lot of gotchas, absolutely. So today, just beginning MELs with the basics, depending on anyone's knowledge in the audience here, it's essentially the ability to temporarily operate an aircraft with an equipment or instrument. It is mostly required across the majority of state registries. If you're flying into a certain area and it could be required, you still have to have it, even if your own registry does not require it. And it's also much easier to actually use than the MMEL. So this tool really allows operators to maintain an acceptable level of safety while also meeting their operational needs. It really is the intersection of manufacturer testing, regulations applicable to your operation, aircraft configuration, and your own departmental procedures.
Yep, this helps keep everything just in one nice place, so you don't have to go guessing and looking through tons of different documents to see if you can safely dispatch your aircraft. Instead, your crews can just turn to the page where the relief is on and just read through and comply with the requirements, and off they go.
Yeah, and some common examples include, field comms, navigation, cabin equipment, but don't worry, we'll get into very detailed specifics here shortly.
But a good starting point for minimum equipment lists is really understanding the requirements. What is actually driving why I need this document to dispatch with inoperative equipment? There are a lot of local, international, and standards requirements for having an MEL, and we'll go ahead and touch on a few of the basics, like the ICAO annexes. For those of you who operate in Europe, the SAFA and SACA requirements that are tied to the European Ramp Inspection Program. Some basic information on state of registry requirements, and also some ISBEO requirements that drive behind this too. I will start off with the state of registry requirements because that one is kind of the wild card. That can run the gambit between the FAAs where they permit MMEL as MEL or MEL versus most other registries that require a full customized MEL. Now, don't worry, most registries do publish a documentation for this. They'll have an MEL preparation guide of some kind. So I'd recommend checking with your state of registry. It's typically on their website and their information forms, and seeing what specifically they require, and it usually provides good guidance on walking through how to actually build the document. So to kind of more of the international side, ICAO Annex 6 is where the minimum equipment list requirement really lies. Now, this is pretty consistent language between ICAO Annex 6 Part 1, 2, and 3, so it applies to those commercial, non-commercial, and helicopter operators. And it generally states that when an MMEL is issued, you should have a customized MEL built for your aircraft. And there is also an attachment in ICAO Annex 6, I believe it's attachment 3B, that kind of goes into the full detail on what specific elements your MEL needs to require. But the big thing is making sure your MEL has been accepted and approved by your state of registry and you're issued authorization to use it. That's a really big driving point behind the ICAO Annex 6 here. Now, kind of tying back to ICAO Annex 6 is this European Union ramp inspection program requirements. So if you think the SAFA or SACA inspections, depending if you're a foreign aircraft operator or community aircraft, the requirement is basically the same across the board for them. You do need to have a fully customized MEL. So if you look at the SAFA standard, that's an element A07. It does explicitly state that you have to have a fully customized MEL for your aircraft. Now, I do highly recommend downloading the Ramp Inspection Program Appendix 1. It goes into implementation instructions and predefined findings for the SAFA inspector. This is basically what they'll be using on the ground to evaluate your aircraft operation against. And you can see in the screenshot on the slide here, it includes quite a few elements that they'll be looking at, but two big ones that I've highlighted are that they're tailored for your aircraft and appropriate. Now, if you are operating where your MEL is not completely tailored to your aircraft, or for some reason you're using the MMEL as an MEL like a lot of FAA operators have, there are pre-described findings that the inspector is going to be looking and will write up if they do notice this when they're doing their inspection. So again, I've taken a screenshot from that ramp inspection program guidance. It will state out what specific thing they're going to be looking for and also the category of findings. So for example, the FAA operators flying with MMEL as MEL, that's a Category 2 finding. So the SAFA inspectors will be contacting the FAA to basically let them know that, hey, you've been operating out of compliance with what the SAFA standard requires. Now, if you're operating with the non-customized MEL and you actually have or a non-customized MMEL or an MEL that's not customized to your aircraft, and they actually do have a relief that's been used, that can actually elevate to a level 3 finding, which can actually result in full grounding of the aircraft. So there are pretty big consequences to this. So I'd highly recommend downloading this document. And before each international flight, just quickly run through it with your flight crew, make sure everybody understands it, and just compare the requirements, make sure you have all your ducks in a row.
And I do would love to express the importance, because not only is, being prepared so you don't get a finding, but this really could go down to, 30 minutes reviewing all your documents, or even up to 3 hours, because, it's also important to exactly know how to reference and use and find your MEL in addition to all the other documents that are required here. That really, time really can make a huge difference.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, and we've actually seen some operators take with their internal audit program. They'll have a regular recurring task, so maybe every few months or before every international flight, to check this document against the SAFA standards. So it is a good way to work this into your safety assurance processes as your part of your SMS as well. So you do have that opportunity too.
Yeah, and I know SAFA member countries have been growing popularity. All the clients we've been talking to, I know Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and obviously most of Europe. Any others off the top of your head?
Yeah, I believe Singapore and the United Arab Emirates as well. So SAFA does extend beyond just the European Union states. There are participating member states as well, like Gary had mentioned. So definitely worth checking. I believe they have a listing in this SAFA inspection guidance that I had mentioned. So before your next international flight, maybe run through that and make sure that you're going to be meeting those SAFA standards, just to kind of streamline any issues that might come up during the trip. Lastly, there are also a few ISBEO requirements for this as well. So those of you who are ISBEO operators, it is tied to ISBEO protocols 14.4 and 14.4.1. The language in this reads very similar to ICAO, which makes sense because ISBEO is based off the ICAO standard, which also reemphasizes that the MEL must be appropriate to the specific configuration of your aircraft. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat here where the implementation guidance, they do have provisions for those of you operating in the United States that have MMEL as MEL. So it's not explicitly forbidden, but you need to make sure you're meeting up to the requirements of your letter of authorization from the authorities. So that does mean you do still have to have your M&O procedures documents, identified regulations, and all the other requirements of LOA D095 for an FAA operator. This is pretty well non-consequence for the more international operators, like say you're on the Bermuda or San Marino registries, because their registries already require that customized MEL. So this is pretty much a free kind of gimme. But for the FAA operators, it is worth kind of watching this just to make sure you're fully in compliance.
Thank you. Wonderful. So now we started with the why. Now we're going to move to all the elements that are kind of make up a minimum equipment list. There are several elements, so we're going to kind of walk you through each of the most popular ones that they make up. So for starters, the MEL, Master Minimum Equipment List. I think that's arguably probably the most important aspect of a custom MEL. So it really can come down. The biggest question we have is, which one do I use? For starters, you'll see here, you want to make sure it's the appropriate aircraft type. We put one of our more extreme cases here of the Hawker of the 30 different plus types and models that could be on an MEL. Most commonly, there's anywhere from 2 to 6, but there are cases to where it can be a large, many options.
This can actually even vary at the avionics level too.
Yep.
We'll see with the Global Express series, they'll have a provision specific for those with global flight vision. So make sure when you're pulling your MMEL that you're pulling the correct one for your aircraft's avionics package and model. So there are a few things to check when you're pulling that information.
Absolutely, and not to fear, we will have a customization discussion a little bit after this. So we'll talk about all the things that we get to trim off as well to make it specific for you. But for starters here, and I do just want to preface, any questions that you have, all stated registries will have some sort of MEL preparation guide. So any direct questions you need outside of having the appropriate resources, you can even talk to a vendor, or you can even reach out to the state registry to get clear guidance before you start building this.
Yeah, we've worked closely with San Marino and Bermuda Civil Aviation Authority. They're very receptive and they're very willing to help. They're happy that you're reaching out looking for this information because ultimately they want you to be operating correctly as well. So there's really no harm in asking.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to begin with kind of the guidance of which to use, once you've established you have the most up-to-date revision and it is the correct type, you will want to ensure that you use the proper MMEL where your aircraft was received the type certification from. It can be a little confusing, but even as we mentioned, preparation guides, talking to registries, vendors, you can definitely get clarified which one is best for your aircraft. And the state registry will openly communicate that to you. So once you get that done, you then want to move to, I guess, the second most important aspect, the maintenance and operations procedures of building this MEL. And it's the same kind of caveat. You want to make sure it's the appropriate revision, it matches your type of the aircraft, and then you also want to go into the avionics package. It could be things as Kevin mentioned, the global vision versus non-global vision. These could be standalone documents. They could have option A, B, and C within the maintenance and operations procedures. So you want to make sure you're matching that specifically to your aircraft type and avionics package.
Now, there might also be cases where maintenance and operations procedures aren't published for your aircraft. This is more common on like a smaller aircraft, so you have a single engine aircraft or an older model like a Sabreliner. Those, unfortunately, you will have to write those yourself, but to do that, I'd really recommend just kind of reading what the MEL is, or MMEL is requiring in that specific item, and look for specific references in your aircraft maintenance manual and aircraft flight manual. most oftentimes registries are okay with you just simply citing those sections, so you don't have to reproduce everything, but just making sure if you're having to write your own maintenance and operations procedures, you're tying it back to that MEL to make sure it's addressing what is required.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I actually have one quick point on the sourcing of your MEL as well. Gary had mentioned for looking for the state of your where your aircraft is type certified. This is mainly true for those operators that are non-FAA, EASA, or Transport Canada, because those registries don't typically publish MELs. Now, when you're an FAA, EASA, or Transport Canada operator, I'd really recommend checking there first, because oftentimes they do publish their own specific MELs. But when in doubt, again, like Gary had mentioned, check with the state of registry, look for any MEL preparation guides, or even reach out to ask if you're confused.
And definitely check with the registry before you start writing it.
Oh, most definitely.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thanks, Kevin. So moving after the kind of two main aspects here, there are some additional components and elements that you need to have most commonly in the front matter. So to start, log revisions, extremely important. This is a controlled document. You must get this approved. If you're building one for the first time, you'll start with an original or name it revision 1 or even reissue 1 depending on what your state of registry prefers. But you will want to start with this. It is very important as you make updates later down the road that you say that you're complying with this updated MEL, or you brought in these updated M&O procedures, or you added or removed aircraft equipment. So you definitely want to have as much information in your log revisions as possible.
And this is actually a good section. We do see some operators expand on this a little bit. So not only just marking which revision number it is, some operators will put a brief comment on what was changed in each update, or some operators will even go further where they list out each specific item and what has changed too. So you can really take this to whatever is going to fit best for your flight department and whatever you think your flight crews are going to respond best to. So I'd recommend kind of considering all options and just choosing appropriately there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Moving to that, another aspect in the front matter will be the preamble. That will follow your state of registry. Make sure it's the most up-to-date version that you're using. And the definitions could also follow under the preamble. Oftentimes it could be a standalone, but make sure you're putting the most up-to-date ones in there. And anything to add?
Yeah, oftentimes your preamble and your definitions will be in the MEL preparation guide prepared by your state of registry. So going back to that document again, you can kind of see how important it's becoming. Now, there are some, of course, exceptions to the rule. The FAA publishes policy letters, but for the most part, you can usually find this information in your MEL preparation guide.
Very nice. And then moving on to that, you will need a control pages section. So every page in that MEL needs to have a line-by-line item. So once you do update that, you are, if you're only updating 3 or 4 pages, bringing in a new update, you are able to outline that on the control pages, and then also, of course, noting on the log revision. And then lastly, policies and procedures. Now, this can be as simple as I want to put in to reference my company operations handbook or flight operations manual or whatever your operation chooses to call it, or you can go through and write your own procedures and policies in there. Again, whatever works for your operation and what makes sense for you and your crew at the time.
And that's something we'll go into a little bit more, a little bit later in the presentation here.
Absolutely. And I did want to also mention the final, most fun part of creating an MEL in the details here. For starters, the Master Minimum Equipment List has a lot of generic text, specifically in column 4, where it'll tell you how to defer the items and what guidelines you need to follow. If it says anything as a CFR or as required by regulation, you will need to go through and put in your own departmental procedures of what applies to your type of operation you're flying, size of aircraft, and even some cases where you're flying to or where you're not flying to.
Yeah, kind of some great examples for this. Like Gary had mentioned, as required by 14 CFRs, typically in the FAA published ones, or as required by regulations in different states. We've done MELs for several different states of registries, and we haven't seen one yet that allows you to keep that language in there. So you do have to update it and correct it to actually reflect those regulations that are applicable to that certain item. So, for example, if you're looking at a VHF communications radio, instead of having that statement, you have to list out where the VHF communications radio can or cannot be inoperative.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then so kind of moving toward that, after you're able to replace the generic text, meet all the regulatory requirements, you will need to ensure that you customize it for your aircraft. It needs to fit your make, model. The MMEL can, as we saw in that Fun Hawker example, you can have almost 30 plus different models where it references. You need to trim out everything that does not apply to your aircraft, anything that could be not applicable to your serial number range, and then also type of operation. There could be some different references there for commercial or non-commercial, depending on your flight rules that you're following. And so it's not just a trim this out just because you're told to. It really can't come down to a clarity and safety for your operation. I mean, you definitely don't want to have your pilots, looking at something that's a later serial number and deferring an item incorrectly, or it can also just clear up what you're looking at, making it as specific as possible for the ease of your own operation.
Yeah, going back to that example earlier, you're not having to rifle through 5 or 6 different documents to find all this data. You don't have to have a copy of the regulations on hand to dig up and look through. You just got it all in one place. So your crew members, it's a little bit of work up front, but your crews, it makes their lives so much easier and will hopefully increase your dispatch speed too.
Right.
Now, a quick note on the customization aspect. It's not only limited to column 4 of your MEL or just the MMEL requirements in general. It can also apply to maintenance and operations procedures. We'll see some manufacturers sneak in references for aircraft with specific modifications or aircraft service changes, service bulletins, that sort of thing. You have to be very careful when you're bringing those into your manual to only bring what applies to. Those are pretty easy to miss, to be honest.
Absolutely. And also, not alone, you can make your MEL much shorter. So that also helps for clarity and ease. But wonderful. So moving to the next aspect, as a vendor, I can speak from plenty of examples. I'm sure Kevin can as well. As we're assisting operators in building questionnaires, and as operators even do it themselves and kind of consult with us, I do want to express the accuracy and how important that is of putting in your equipment, because it's not all about just customization, trimming off things that don't apply, filling in column 4. It's all centered around the quantity items and if things are installed on your aircraft. And so the last thing you want to do is say, I'm not sure about this item, I'm just going to go ahead and say remove it because I don't think it's on there. And then a year down the road, end up halfway across the world and realize that you do have this installed and you don't have relief for it. A common example we see here are fire extinguishers. Right here you'll see that 3 are installed for this MEL and 2 are required. Most often than not, for most all aircraft commonly that we work on, 2 are always required, especially for most commonly across state of registries and the regulations here as far as size of aircraft and everything. You will see that if an operator is looking at this and says, yes, I think we have a couple fire extinguishers, let's just put 2. If you put that in, you will then realize 2 are installed and 2 is required, which you have to remove from your MEL and gives you no deferral relief. So this could be something as simple as, not taking the time to count correctly, forgetting about, the fire extinguisher here and in this drawer over, on the left side of the aircraft, or it could even be saying, hey, I realize 2 are required, I have 2 installed, maybe I need a 3rd one to be able to give myself relief. There are a lot of options here. There's a lot of detail when it comes to equipment that you really should take the time to do to maximize and really utilize the MEL for yourself.
Yeah, and I'm glad Gary included this example of fire extinguishers specifically, because this can vary on seat count for most registries too. So a good example is the FAA. If you're a Part 91 operator, if you have fewer than 6 passenger seats on your plane, you'll only need 1 fire extinguisher. So what you put for your quantities for what you think might be unrelated items can affect other items too. So ensuring that accuracy is pretty key to making sure your MEL is fully customized and accurate to your airplane. Because that could technically even be tied back to that SAFA finding, where the MEL is not fully, they can argue the MEL is not fully customized if it's not accurate to your airplane. So make sure you're just really taking the time to go through this. I know it's quite a bit of upfront work, to be honest. I'm not going to lie to you there. But once you have that upfront work done, it becomes much easier to manage because that part's already done with. You just have to account for changes in the future.
Right, right. And also, please note, the fire extinguishers is just one of many examples. I mean, all throughout the MEL, there are 1 and 2 items required for installation that you could see. I know the TCAS is a popular section of just an operator thinking, yep, we have a TCAT, so they put 1 for all the related items, which a lot of those come down to 2 installed required to be able to defer any item. So please be as specific as possible. Look up front. You can look in the flight manual, limitation section, maintenance reports, walking through the aircraft and just counting things. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can really ensure the accuracy as you're going through to build this MEL.
Yep, yeah, the inaccuracy can range from anything like Gary was mentioning, you can't dispatch the aircraft, or if you put a wrong number in and your MEL's prepared incorrectly, you could be in violation of your regulations. So take extreme caution with that.
Absolutely. All right, and we can't discuss MELs without touching on NEFs. Also, there's the perfect companion to your MEL. So the non-essential equipment and furnishings is a program for an operator to review through and deem if anything could be non-essential to flight that does not affect safety. If something were to malfunction, break, or any of the above. So it is a program that guides you. You do kind of depending on state of registries, can always do things a little differently. But in general, it's essentially examples such as cabin items, passenger entertainment, galley items. So for some specific examples, it could be anywhere from a cup holder, coat hangers, a coffee maker, all the way up to aircraft trim, or even an air show display system. Now, that really, it really can depend. I do want to clarify, you do have to have an MEL in place, or you have to be building one in the process of getting it approved to have an NEF program. You can't just have a standalone NEF program. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't have a standalone document. You can always have it, you can put it at the end of your MEL, you can have a standalone one. It doesn't always need to be aircraft specific or tail specific, just as your MEL does, but that's ultimately up to the state of registry and how they like to see it, which also should be very clear in your preparation guide which the registry will release. And if not, reach out and ask, definitely be as clear as possible. And I also want to stress the order of importance. So you want to review the CDL, then the MEL to make sure it's not listed in there, then you can go through the NEF program. You can have a list of 100 plus items in the NEF as you go on, or you can just kind of go case by case basis to review that when things become faulty or break or you run into any kind of those situations.
Yeah, a great example of that one we see pretty often are the sun visors to block sunlight in the cockpit. Some aircraft do cover that in their MEL. So really, you have to check the MEL first because that takes precedence over the NEF. Now, if that's not stated in your MEL, but you deem it as non-essential, you can put that into your NEF program and apply for those airplanes. But say you have a Cessna 680, I believe those are in that MEL, so you'd have to use the MEL for that specifically.
Right.
Okay, now that we've kind of got just the structure of an MEL down here, we'll talk about some operational practices. So things like documenting compliance and execution of actually using your MEL. So we'll kind of talk about how to actually log discrepancies, how to prepare the procedures for how your crews are going to be actioning that, how your crews are going to be taking a look at your M&O procedures, the actual remarks and exceptions of the MEL, and then lastly, some execution considerations that we often see operators have questions with. So to start off with policies and procedures, we recommend kind of doing this first because this is going to give your team the structure on how they're actually going to be using their MEL day to day. So the key word here is procedure. You need an actual procedure for your crew and maintenance to log the discrepancy. Now, procedure is a little bit of a tricky word to some people, but a great way to think about this is include the who, what, when, where, and how. So if you're just including a very basic blanket statement that doesn't address these elements, your crews might have questions on how to actually action things, and they might take the wrong path to actually doing something. So while you're reviewing your actual structured procedures, just kind of think about who's going to end up recording the discrepancy, what that person's going to be recording, when that's actually going to be recorded, if it's going to be before flight, during the pre-flight briefing, where you're going to be noting that discrepancy, and how you're going to be communicating that record and actioning any required items. Now, I believe Gary mentioned this before with the NEF, but the MEL's policies and procedures can be in a myriad of different documents too, depending on what your state of registry is asking for. But for the most part, we usually see operators either put this in their MEL, their company operations manual, or for those commercial operators, they'll have a dedicated MEL management program. So again, check with that MEL preparation guide. That usually clarifies it for you. But if you have any questions, you can reach out to your state registrar or even us. We'll be happy to help with that. So I've got an example of an aircraft discrepancy log, just kind of a very basic sample one. This kind of reinforces, it's got a lot of blank fields, and honestly, they can be a little bit confusing if you're looking at it for the first time. So this is where your procedures are really going to help you. You're going to kind of want to outline as if you're walking through this form. So meet the who, what, when, where, and how of how your team members are going to be filling this out. Mention to your pilot in command where they're going to be writing this information down, how the maintenance team is going to be reporting things, and how people are going to sign off for dispatch, and then once the discrepancy is rectified, how they're actually going to be noting that too. So a good starting point is if you have an established aircraft discrepancy log, take a look at it, see how things are noted, and kind of explain that in words for your procedures. But again, make sure you're hitting that who, what, when, where, how. Now this one, it's kind of a paper example of it, but you can also do this electronically too. I know there are a lot of computerized maintenance programs that have a built-in squawk or MEL deferral process written into it. But the process is going to be the same. You're just going to be walking through that, how you're actually going to be completing that in the system, but write it down. Make sure your crew members have something to fall back on if there's ever any questions. And once you have that established too, make sure they're trained on it. At least do initial training, but we highly recommend doing periodic training just kind of as a basic refresher. I mean, people forget if they don't have to do things frequently. If you have a great airplane that never breaks down, I mean, I'm sure we all wish we'd had that. You might not have to use this form as much, and your team might forget things. So periodically review it, maybe every year or two, just kind of take the dust off of it. Now, another kind of tricky question we get is how to actually use the MEL, and specifically which relief options do I use? So you'll see in this example here, sometimes we'll have two different relief options available for a specific item, and it's a little bit ambiguous, which one do I pick? So really, when you're trying to determine which relief to use, ask yourself a few quick questions. Can we actually comply with the requirements and exceptions that the MEL is asking for? So if an item specifically says we can't do ETOPS operations, but you have ETOPS planned, you can't use that item. So see if there is an alternate relief that would let you dispatch that way. Otherwise, you're going to have to either change your flight profile or you can't operate. Can we actually perform the M&O procedures if they're going to be required? So is your crew going to be comfortable performing that operations procedure in practice? Or is the aircraft currently located at the base where maintenance personnel aren't available, but there's a required M procedure? You really do have to consider these things when selecting that specific relief option to make sure you're picking the right one. And also, kind of last but not least, can we meet that repair interval that the MEL is requiring? So that letter, and typically column 1 of your MEL, that defines a specific interval on when you have to have something repaired. I mean, there are some variances based on state of registry, but for the most part, you rely on that repair category to determine how quickly you have to have an item repaired. So look at that in column 4. That will also sometimes include some requirements, and make sure you're going to actually be able to continue operating within that any requirements the MEL is outlining for you.
And I would like to add, everything here, even when you're following the MEL and the MNOs, it doesn't always have to be set in stone of follow this, follow this. I mean, you of course cannot make it less, you have to make it more restrictive. You could also provide additional resources or procedures, or even I know some operators say, hey, this looks like an O procedure, but I really want my maintenance person to be able to look at this, and they kind of can turn into a maintenance procedure. I mean, you can always make it more restrictive. So don't forget that everything you're doing can also be more clarified to work for your operation.
Yeah, exactly. I was actually working with an operator yesterday that had a few instructions for crew members to pull and collar circuit breakers. Now, they in their FSDO didn't really like that. So they had actually walked that back and added in an M procedure where the MMAL didn't require it. They're making it a little bit more restrictive by adding that M procedure, but it's enhancing their safety. So whatever your team feels most comfortable with, as long as you're not becoming less restrictive than the MEL.
Absolutely.
And this is also kind of where customization is going to come down too, going back to Gary's point earlier. If there's specific wording for a relief item, that's never going to apply to your airplane. So say one's specific for RVSM operations. If you're never going to fly your aircraft RVSM or you're not authorized, you're going to have to trim that off because that's not something you're going to ever be using. So it'll take away some of the guesswork for your crews if you do really pay close attention to that customization element. Now, another very tricky point that we run into are multiple inoperative items. So what if multiple items are actually deferred? So say you've got a cockpit headset that's inoperative and a hand microphone that's inoperative. What should we really be thinking about when we're seeing if we can fly safely? So you'll have to kind of look at the interrelationship between the items. Are these a similar system, or will they in some way affect one another? Or will complying with one relief unduly make the second relief impossible to comply with? So there's a little bit of cross-comparing you're going to have to do just to make sure you're going to actually be able to action what's required by your MEL. Take a look at how that's going to affect your aircraft operation. So I had mentioned the restriction on ETOPS before. So if that specific relief item prohibits ETOPS operations, you can't do that. So make sure your flight profiles, you're not going to have to use ETOPS operations. We'll also see some examples where it requires a specific AFM or aircraft operating manual procedure to be used, making sure your crews are aware of that and actually using that procedure in their operation day to day. And also consider any increases in workload. I know Dassault specifically, they have a good consideration for if your autopilot's inoperative, that you should be considering your crew members' workload. Because if you're hand flying the aircraft, that's adding a little bit more additional workload and mental load onto your crew members. So that might be a case where you want to consider possibly changing your duty times up, maybe do crew swaps a little bit more frequently to make things a little bit easier. Now, also take a look at your MEL remarks and exceptions. There are some relief provisions, and I'll show an example in a second, that do prohibit other items from being inoperative or require certain items to be operative to dispatch. So make sure you're checking that too when you have multiple things that are not operating on your aircraft. And lastly, kind of more the SMS element. Make sure you're taking this into consideration in your risk assessment. A lot of operators nowadays are using flight risk assessment tools, and I've seen most of them available on the market that do have a specific consideration for if an MEL item is active. Now, if you're using a fixed number FRAT, that might be, like say, a fixed value of 3, but when you're operating with multiple things inoperative, you might find that risk level is elevated a little bit. So take that into consideration, maybe bump up that risk level or put in an additional mitigation to help kind of relieve some of that concern. And going back to that example of multiple inoperative items, you could see here for the example for the headset boom microphones, I've got it highlighted here where the associated hand microphone needs to be operative to use that relief. So say the SIC's headset boom microphone is broken and their hand microphone is broken too, they can't use that specific relief option. So they're either going to have to see if there's another available option, in this case, there is an option beneath it, or they can't dispatch. So that's how closely you really do have to read to make sure you're not going against what your MEL requires and what your regulations require.
Wonderful. So today we kind of discussed, what an MEL is, why we need it, what it entails, and Kevin just gave a great briefing of how to actually use it. So today we wanted to leave you with how to keep it current and up to date. I do want to preface this MEL that you're building or have built, or whether you go and look at it or not, depending on any situation you're in, is a living, breathing document. It's not one of those documents that you create one time, put it on the shelf, have your crew use it for 15 plus years without any updates. Rules and regulations are constantly changing. Aircraft equipment is constantly changing. Aircraft are constantly changing. So there are a lot of factors here that you want to make sure you keep up to date. And I do want to discuss the big difference between required and recommended updates. So I have here on the slide the kind of bigger required updates that all operators must comply with. We're going to cover those first and then move to some recommended ones. MEL revisions. Keep an absolute eye out for that. I highly recommend subscribing to any kind of subscription service from your registry, letting you know when things get updated. I can say firsthand, Kevin and I also live off that between all registries. So it's very helpful. Stay up to date with what's going on, what's being updated. Anytime an MEL revision comes out, you do have most commonly about 60 to 90 days to comply with it, depending on your registry. Then moving toward any equipment changes, any type of service bulletins, STCs come out, any additional relief or removal of relief for your aircraft, you do need to comply with that. Airworthiness directives, ADs. I know we just saw an example I like to use. The Global just had an FAA MEL update recently between the past year, and then a few months later, an airworthiness directive came out. So even if you do, as all wonderful operators do, comply with the MEL between the 60 to 90 days, get everything updated, have that approved, ready to rock. You also, if an AD comes out within a month or two, you also have to comply with that. So once you comply with that, update your MEL, go to the log of revisions, make it a new revision, keep track, put in there that you complied with the new AD, and then carry on.
Yep. For that, if you're utilizing a maintenance department, typically they're the ones who will initially read through an AD, or if you're utilizing a camo as well, reach out to them, work with your maintenance teams, make sure there are specific requirements for updating your MEL, because those will typically be outlined in there and say exactly what you have to do, and if it does not apply to you.
Right. And lastly, adding or removing aircraft. As an operator, you have the lateral of, as long as it fits the correct type of your MEL, you can put as many aircraft as you'd like on there. Even if you have a Hawker, you can, if you own all 30 plus models, you could technically put it all on one custom MEL. We don't necessarily recommend it, but you do have the lateral to do so as long as it matches the type.
Now, mind you, that is a little bit subject to state registry. For the most part, we do see that states of registry do allow multiple aircraft on one document, so long as they're covered by the same MEL. But a little bit of a word of caution, if you do operate different types, make sure you have some way in your MEL to identify what applies to what type. So whether it be a different color font or bolded wording or something like that, just make sure it's very readily clear to your crews, just to make sure they're not accidentally using the wrong thing. And if you do find it gets too complicated, it might be worth utilizing separate MELs.
Of course. Not always recommended, but of course, always double check with your state of registry, their standards, and their guides going out before you put any length of time to do anything in your minimum equipment list. But anytime you add or remove one to a fleet, that will require an update, whether you get one in or you're removing one off occurrence, in any of that way. And then now kind of moving toward what is a recommended update. That could be as simple as a recommended MEL revision. Kevin, I believe it's anything from, instead of going from revision 3 to 4, that could be as simple as revision 3A that you don't necessarily have to require with, depending on, as long as it could be administrative, anything in the front matter, as long as it's not really affecting safety.
Yeah, that's typically how the FAA publishes it. They'll do what they call a lettered revision. Operators that utilize Transport Canada MELs, they have what they call temporary revisions. So those can still apply to your aircraft. Make sure you're reviewing them, and if the new relief options that those are bringing in do apply, it's very, very highly recommended to bring them in immediately. That way, you're giving your crews the most relief options possible and keeping it to the latest and greatest. It's one less thing you're going to have to update the next time the MEL is getting a required revision as well, because those typically just roll right over.
Right. And then kind of moving on to, there are other recommended ones, such as preambles. Once a new preamble gets up to date, you don't immediately have to drop everything and bring that into a revision. You do, however, have to bring that in next time you do an official revision. So if you want to change equipment and a preamble has gotten updated, or the definitions portion or something of the front matter does need to change, you must bring that in with your new revision.
Yeah, now a little bit of a word of caution on that too. That's typically how we see registries publish that guidance for preambles and definitions, but if your inspector specifically asks you to do that, they do have the latitude to actually force you to require to do that. So really go by what your state of registry is requiring and what your inspectors are asking of you for that.
Absolutely. And one of the kind of later things here is something that's recommended, but for us, we feel should be an absolute requirement: changes to operation. If you have a trip coming up and you don't have the time to get one updated and approved. Is it absolutely necessary to do it within this week versus within the month? Not always, but a common example that we see is a lot of operational procedures mention flight attendants. So whether you create your MEL and you have all throughout your MEL to reference your flight attendants will be communicating to passengers about certain equipment, opening cabin doors, alerting the pilots of anything going on. Whether you have those procedures or not, if you all of a sudden remove the need for flight attendants or you don't fly with them more commonly, we do highly recommend and feel that it should be more of a required update that you get those policies and procedures up to date. It could also affect safety, processes, really give clarity for the crew. You could also go the opposite way. If you don't have flight attendants and all of a sudden you start picking them up more, add them into your operations. It can also make this work for you. If every other flight you have a flight attendant crew, maybe add in both options for depending on which flight. It really can vary.
Yeah, and you'll start to see some of this stuff actually starts tying back to each other too. So Gary also spoke about the equipment changes. If you have a new equipment change, that also affects how your aircraft can operate. So say you've just installed a CPDLC system, you're going to want to make sure your CPDLC system is reflected throughout your MEL, including any operational requirements. So say maybe with your SATCOM item, if you're using a FANS 1A system that's tied to your SATCOM, you might want to include a note about your RCP and RSP requirements for those international operations where those might be required. So these things do loop back into each other, and just be alert to that.
Absolutely. And one of the last things I kind of want to close with, of everything that we're speaking with today, rules, regulations, the why, what you need to include, as long as an operator is following the regulations and making this more restrictive, really need to figure out a way to make this work for you and your organization. If you're the type of organization that wants to build out every procedure in the most detail possible, it's very lengthy, absolutely do that. If you want it short and you want to reference something, or as far as clarity, do what works for your operation as long as the state of registry allows it and will approve the MEL. It really needs to work for you and not the other way around. This is supposed to be guidance, helpful, and above all, to make every operator safer.
And to kind of continue on, we don't actually have a slide for this, but we did get a question before the webinar came up that somebody wanted us to discuss how to use electronic MELs specifically. Most states of registry do have some provision for it. Now again, that does highly vary on your state of registry. FAA Part 91 operators, there's not really any letter of authorization you have to gain for that. So you are permitted to use an electronic MEL on your iPad or portable EFB. And most inspectors are pretty clear about that too. I believe the SAFA's ramp inspection guidance specifically has considerations for if you have a document on an EFB. So you'll see most part globally, as long as you're following what your state of registry requires and authorizes you to do, you should be okay utilizing that electronic document, but it's always worth checking the state AIPs and regulatory guidance before you operate into an unfamiliar area, just to be 100% sure. Now, if you are, say, a FAA Part 135 operator or a Bermuda operator or tied to San Marino, there are specific requirements to get authorization to use electronic manuals. So just work with your state of registry and make sure you have that button down before you start utilizing just the electronic version of your MEL.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. Well,
all right.
Thank you so much. That's all we have as far as our presentation.
Great. Gary, Kevin, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. So I thought this might come up, and I have two questions related to DO95 and D195. So just to prep you there for a moment, the first one is, when is a D195 going to be required in Europe? At present, we operate on a DO95. Does the FAA have plans to cancel all DO95 at some point?
Yeah, that one's kind of a little bit of a two-pronged question. D195, the custom MEL, is actually currently required in Europe. So if you go back to that ramp inspection guidance, I highly recommend going to the EASA's website and downloading that. It explicitly does say you cannot utilize the MMEL as an MEL, so you do have to have that customized MEL in place. Now, the FAA kind of disagrees a little bit on that point. They feel that their newly written guidance for D095 complies with ICAO, but again, EASA specifically says you cannot utilize the MMEL as an MEL. So domestic operations, you can use that MMEL as MEL, but as soon as you start going international, you're subject to these ICAO requirements, and most states are pretty clear where they do follow ICAO unless they file an exception in their state AIP.
Okay. And the other one on the D195 is, what have you seen regarding the FAA and D195 when there are changes to the MEL? Resubmit the LOA, or will the FAA accept revisions without a new LOA application?
Yeah, we typically see the FAA just accept you sending them a copy of the updated manual. You don't need to reapply. Your LOA is still in effect, and I believe the FAA gives you 90 days to update too. So you can continue to use your MEL while the FAA is reviewing, and then as soon as they approve it, you can use that new version. But they typically don't need you to go through a whole brand new application process or anything like that. It's just as simple as them taking a look at what's changed and essentially restamping it for you.
Okay. Just a comment here stating it's important to remember that each state makes their own regulations. Even a, quote, difference filed in the AIP might not be accepted by that state. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is true. That's why, again, we're really emphasizing take a look at your state's regulations that you're going to be operating into, just to make sure you're complying completely with what they're asking for.
Okay. This is a pretty open question. It says, how far should customization go?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it. To be honest, that was really kind of how I closed, make it work for you. You know, you can take it as far as you need. You have to, of course, remove other type and model and serial number references. So as long as you remove that and remove the generic text, that is kind of the minimum of what you'll need to do. But if you can take it even farther for ease, clarity, and kind of safety concerns for your operation, then you can really run with it.
Yeah, and again, it's really about making the document easy for your team to use. If you do feel like customizing something to include specific verbiage from your flight operations manual is going to be important to you, that's something you might want to consider bringing in, whereas another operator, they might not have an established flight operations manual to update with. So that's going to be highly dependent on how you and your team feel.
Great, thank you for that. Here's a real specific one. It says, what about adding a new Wi-Fi system to an aircraft?
Yeah, that one's going to depend on what your MMEL. Yeah, it depends on what the MMEL is actually including. A lot of MMELs don't include specific provisions for Wi-Fi, but some do. So first check your MMEL, and then if it's not in there, but you're utilizing the Wi-Fi for mainly cabin entertainment purposes, like say you have the executive needs to use the Wi-Fi for business calls or something like that, you can add that to your NEF program. So Gary mentioning that NEF program specifically, that's typically the go-to if your MEL doesn't cover something, but it's not going to impact crew or operational safety.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, I have two airplanes of the same type. Can I put them on the same MMEL?
Yeah, most often, yes, but it really depends on where the state of registry. So double check that. As long as they say it's okay, you absolutely can.
Yeah, we've seen Transport Canada, FAA, Bermuda, specifically examples of those where they've accepted that. And I'm sure most other state of registries do have provisions for that, because most often they also handle airlines with multiple airplanes too. So odds are yes, but again, go back to that MEL preparation guide. And if there's any ambiguity, just reach out to them, and they should be able to clarify that too.
Okay, and next, where do I put my procedures for differing items?
Now, differing items, I might need a little bit more clarification on that, but in terms of, like if an item varies for if you can use it or not depending on circumstance, that's typically written into your company policies and procedures.
Okay. Also, do I need to keep a paper copy of an MEL on board?
Yeah, so FAA, I know that's not required, but again, that really can go down to the state of registry and what they want to see. As Kevin mentioned, Certain ones you have to get electronic requests to be able to have that in approval. So it really can depend, but we've commonly seen yes.
Yep, yeah, exactly. Just make sure that your registry either does or does not require an authorization of some kind to utilize electronic manuals. So for those FAA Part 91 operators, you're kind of lucky here. The FAA doesn't. So you are able to utilize the electronic MEL, and I believe the SAFA's, the EU ramp inspection guidance also mentions that in their documentation as well. So most areas are accepting of electronic documents as long as you have a suitable backup available, whether that be another EFB or paper copy if you wanted to carry it. But making sure that you've just got those backups available and you're meeting any requirements by your state of registry.
Okay. Back on DO95s, do you guys know if there's any kind of timeline when the FAA will no longer provide the DO95 as acceptable for an MEL?
Yeah, they were kind of going back and forth on that for the past few years here. By the latest FAA's advisory circular, 9187A, I believe it is, they had just stated that they're not planning on actually backing off on that completely. So they've included new requirements for getting D095 for a Part 91 operator, but from what we understand, they're not planning on phasing it out now.
Okay, good to know. Thank you for that. All right, just a couple more here for time. Do you have any recommendations about resources to help build an MEL in my state of registry?
Yeah, I would first start on the state of registry website. They all have versions of preparation guides that say you need this, this, and this. Outside of that, I know there are a lot of great consultants, vendors. It really depends on if you would like kind of third-party help or not. But if not, follow the MEL, add the O procedures in there, and the registry should be able to go back and forth to see what's acceptable and what's not, and kind of what works for your operation.
Yeah, those MEL preparation guides we keep talking about, those are super helpful. They're usually very, very clear in what you can and cannot have in your MEL and what you need to actually update. So that's typically, at least in our experience, our go-to source first. So we'll do that, and then we'll look at the MEL for the specific aircraft type and kind of start building from there. But definitely kind of recommend looking at that first.
All right, and I also wanted to, I'm posting this. There is a link through Aviation Manuals to download an MEL guide. So I just want everyone to note that I've just put that in your chat function as well.
Wonderful.
Okay, one last question. What's the advantage to using a fleet MEL versus using an individual MEL for each aircraft?
Yeah, so assuming you're allowed to do it and your state of registry is fine, the best advantage is document management. Certain things get updated, as we mentioned, definitions, preamble, adding a piece of equipment. It's easier to manage one document, write the procedures for that, get it approved, and then so you're able to keep multiple copies on all aircraft. So essentially, being able to change one and being able to affect the rest. If not, we do have many operators too that we deal with that do like to keep them separate. So it really comes down to a matter of preference.
Yeah, exactly. It's that document control issue. If you're updating a procedure in one that's going to apply to the others, you have to remember to update all five, and most oftentimes have to get that all five reapproved through the specific registry as well, because most MEL updates for most states registry do need you to resubmit them for approval. So you're going to have to resubmit 5 documents versus 1. But again, if you do find that too cumbersome to include it all in one, there is no problem with splitting it out.
Okay, perfect. Gary, Kevin, thank you so much for just an awesome presentation today. I hope we'll have you back on our SafetyNet series sometime soon. Just reiterate that I've put the link to the Aviation Manuals MEL guide download, so everybody do that. Also, if you guys would go to your next slide, I think it has your contact information. There we go.
Yes, please, anyone feel free to reach out if you have any questions or just want to talk and nerd out about MELs. We love it. So.
All right. Well, clearly, and it's very clear and understandable. So thank you very much for breaking that down
Of
for
course.
us today. Also, if there are any questions that we didn't answer today due to time, and just want you all to know that they'll be going to our presenters and they will try to get back to you. Otherwise, you've got their email here. And thank you so much for attending the Safety Net today. Just an FYI, we'll be having another Safety Net on current topics about remotely piloted aircraft systems from the Unmanned Safety Institute. It has been an absolute pleasure having Kevin and Gary here from Aviation Manuals. Thank you guys so much for your time. Great presentation. And I wish you all some safe travels, and we'll see you at the next Safety Net. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much for having us.